Welcome to How the World Works Introduction to Radical Thought, where we learn to see the world from a radical perspective, very much like Sacco over here. This is Sacco. But before I say more about Sacco, I should say something about the person wearing Sacco on his hand. This is Bo Burnham. And if you don't know Bo, Bo is a comedian, and his comedy is often socially critical, and I would say that sometimes it's quite radical. And this here might be Bo Burnham's most radical bit. It's called How the World Works. You can watch it on YouTube. And in this video, Bo sings a children's song.
Hey kids.
Describing how the world works, and the picture that the song paints for the children is very optimistic. It's about how the bees and the flowers and everyone in the ecosystem does their part so that the sum total of all of these symbiotic relationships is a whole that is balanced and harmonious, right? How wonderful. But then Sako shows up
It's Socko.
in the middle of the song, and Bo asks Sako to also say something about how the world works. And Sako says, okay, I'll try,
All right.
and he sings a verse of his own. However, very quickly we realize that Sako has a profoundly different understanding of the world we live in. For Sako, the world we live in isn't based on balance and cooperation, but rather on conflict and oppression. The world is built on genocide and exploitation, and the FBI killed Martin Luther King, and so on. Things that one does not expect to hear in polite society, certainly not in a children's song. And that's what's so funny and so shocking about this song. It's this tension between the upbeat tune and Sako being this magical and goofy character, and on the other hand, the content of Sako's words is so dark and cynical. It's a great bit by Bo Burnham. And in this video here, I'd like to say something about Sako's way of seeing the world, this kind of rebellious and radical perspective that you never learned about in school. Now, incidentally, when we talk about radicalism, there is left-wing radicalism and there's also right-wing radicalism. And they can sometimes appear similar, at least superficially. Both are skeptical about mainstream narratives, both reflect the consciousness of marginalized groups struggling against the powerful. Sako's radicalism is of the leftist kind. For example, at one point in the song, Sako quotes Karl Marx, Marx being, of course, an important leftist thinker. And in this video, I will indeed be talking about left-wing radicalism. I would definitely love to make a separate video and talk about right-wing radicalism and compare the two, but today I'll be talking about radicalism from the left. Now, another thing that I should clarify before we get started is the relationship between left-wing radicalism and indeed Marxism. These are not necessarily the same thing. Sako may or may not be a Marxist. Sako does quote Marx, like I said, but you can be a left-wing radical who reads Marx and quotes Marx without necessarily being a Marxist.
Surely you're not a communist.
Do I have to be a communist to read Karl Marx?
It's perfectly legitimate to accept some things that Marx said while reserving the right to not necessarily accept everything that might come with Marxist orthodoxy. However, it is true that all left-wing radicals, be they Marxists or not, all of them do owe a lot to Karl Marx and to his friend Friedrich Engels. So this is Karl Marx, and this is his friend Friedrich Engels. And we owe a lot to these two, especially for something that they gave us that is called materialism. Materialism is a kind of method or approach to understanding the world we live in, and it is a method that Marx and Engels did a lot to formulate and to promote. And I believe that this method is essential for good radical thinking. It's an extremely powerful tool for deconstructing propaganda and seeing clearly what's really going on. And again, you don't have to accept all of the baggage of so-called Marxism in order to recognize that this thing called materialism is a very effective method to understanding the world. So let's see what materialism is, and also let's apply this method to different case studies to see how it works. So what is materialism? When we talk about materialism, we mean this as opposed to idealism. You are a materialist if you believe that the material comes first, it's more basic, it's primary, and it is what then creates and conditions and determines the realm of ideas, okay, the realm of consciousness, which comes second. And you're an idealist if you see it the other way around, if you think that ideas come first, okay, and then they inform the world of matter. And you can apply this model to different domains. You can apply this to metaphysics, which is the study of the ultimate stuff of reality. In fact, if you've heard the term materialist before, it was probably in this context. A materialist in this context is someone who believes that the primary stuff of reality is, say, atoms and molecules, who sometimes come together to form simple, mindless organisms, who then evolve into animals with some cognitive abilities, who then evolve into animals with language, who then come up with different ideas. Among them, the idea of God. Do you see? So God comes last for the metaphysical materialist, not first. God is merely an idea, and ideas or consciousness in general is never disembodied. Consciousness is an effect of the body. It grows out of the material, and it is conditioned by the material, and it does not have an independent existence. An idealist believes that first there was God, this disembodied consciousness, okay? And God had an idea, let there be light. And thus was created the material world. The material world was created in the image of the ideas in the mind of God. So ideas inform the material world. This doesn't have to be strictly religious, by the way. There is a Platonist version of the idealist worldview. In any case, I actually don't care if you are a materialist or an idealist when it comes to metaphysics. I don't think that this is important. It is true that Marx and Engels were materialists when it came to metaphysics, but I don't believe that this is essential. What matters to us here today is not metaphysical materialism, but rather materialism as it is applied to society, okay, to history, to how the world works in terms of the relationship between us human beings. So what would it mean to be a materialist in this sense? Well, for a materialist, since the dawn of humankind, history has always been asking a single fundamental question. And this is the question: how do we human beings divide among us the resources, the labor, and the fruits of the labor? Let's call this wealth. How do we divide these things among us? This is the most important question. And the way that we as a collective settle this question through conflict, through struggles, through warfare, through manipulation, the kind of socio-economic order that we end up establishing among ourselves, this is the material aspect of our collective existence as human beings. So capitalism, for example, is a kind of answer to this question. And feudalism was a different kind of answer to this question. And it is this material aspect of our society that then informs our collective consciousness, which is mostly the consciousness of the powerful, right? Those who end up holding the resources and commanding the labor and appropriating most of the wealth. They inevitably use their power to contribute disproportionately to our collective consciousness. They control the priests, they sponsor the artists, they employ the historians, they own the billboards, and so on. And that's how we get our political culture, our philosophy, our mythology, our common sense, and so on. All of this, our consciousness as a society, reflects this kind of subconscious socioeconomic order. Now, an idealist, on the other hand, sees society perfectly upside down. An idealist says, once there was a man, right? And it is always a man, some great man, a philosopher or a prophet. And this great man brought us an idea. He had an idea. And he brought us an idea of how things should work. And we said, wow, what a great idea. And we built our society based on these ideas, on these values, on what the Torah says, or on what the Quran says, or on what the Enlightenment says, and so on. So you see, our ideas, our values, our culture, our mentality, our moral choices, that's what makes us who we are. And that's what makes other societies what they are, for better or for worse. Now, it may not seem that way, but every one of us is either a materialist or an idealist, consciously or not. And it makes a big difference to be one or the other. It makes a radical difference one way or the other. Let's see how exactly. Let's apply this to some case study. Let's apply this to our own modern society. We'll see how an idealist and how a materialist see our society, and how the two perspectives lead to radically different conclusions about who we are, about the nature of our relationship to each other and to other societies. Let's apply this to our own modern society. In what kind of a society do we live in today? Now, when I was a boy, I was taught in school that I live in a liberal democracy. And it was explained to me that liberal democracy is this idea, right, or set of ideas that we inherited from great men, such as John Locke and Montesquieu and the founding fathers of the United States. All these great minds who came together in order to solve an age-old problem, which is the contradiction between government and freedom, right? There's this ancient contradiction between us human beings having a need for government, which is taken here for granted. Someone has to rule over us for our own good. But then there's also the danger that government might turn against the interests of the governed. It might rule over us not for our own good. It might become tyrannical. And so the great men who founded our modern liberal democratic society, they came up with the idea, right, that government or the king, or let's call this the executive, should be subjected to a legislative assembly that would represent the will of the governed. Very well. However, we are not done yet. You see, our founding fathers, in their infinite wisdom, recognized another problem. They recognized that the will of the governed, as expressed by a majority vote, also poses a threat. A majority might also turn tyrannical. I mean, just imagine if one day a majority vote would call for the extermination of all red-headed people, who are a small minority in the population. Should the executive comply with such a murderous majority vote? Should the will of the people be executed in this case? Of course not. The minority should be protected from the tyranny of the majority. So it's essential that the legislative assembly would also be limited. It's necessary to bar the assembly from legislating against individual rights. There are certain rights that must never be put to a vote, rights that should stand outside of the political process. And these rights will be defined by a Bill of Rights and a high court. Let's call this the judiciary. So you see, liberal democracy is this ingenious design with checks and balances. And it is this political culture that constitutes our society. We are a society defined by its liberal democratic values, to which we owe our wealth and happiness. And when we are opposed by other societies, these are societies with opposing ideas, such as communism or fascism or political Islam and so on. And these are all bad ideas, yeah? These are inferior ideas. Winston Churchill famously said that liberal democracy is the worst form of government that has ever existed, except for all the other ones. Which is to say, although liberal democracy is imperfect, it's patently the best form of government in all of recorded history. It's this wonderful achievement of the human mind, this wonderful legacy of the Enlightenment. Thanks to this invention, we can have it both ways. We have a government, but we're also free. How wonderful. Okay, now what would a materialist say about all of this? For a materialist, this is all very naive. A materialist would say that our modern society is first and foremost a capitalist society, because capitalism is our answer to this question of how do we divide the resources, the labor, and the fruits of the labor among us. Capitalism's answer to this question is that a small minority of human beings will get to hold virtually all of the resources necessary for our collective survival as their own private exclusive property. Now, when I say resource, I mean something that is potentially wealth, okay, but which needs to be mixed with labor before the wealth can be produced. For example, land is a resource that needs to be worked, right? You work the land. And a coal mine is a resource that needs to be mined. A factory is a resource that needs to be operated, and so on. Marx would call this a means of production. I'm just going to call this a resource. So in capitalism, the resources are owned by a relatively small minority of people, and they own it as their private property. This is important. Notice that private property isn't just the right to access a certain resource, but it's the right or the supposed right to exclude others from accessing that resource. That's what private property means. For example, there was a time when in England there was land to which everyone had a right to access. This was the commons. Everybody had property in this resource. It was common property. And then agrarian capitalists came and enclosed this land. They put up fences and claimed private property over the land, which means they claimed the right to exclude everyone else from accessing this land. So in capitalism, a minority claims private property over the resources, whether in agriculture or in industry or today in cyberspace, which means, by definition, that most of the members of society are being excluded, are being denied access to the resources, which brings up the question, how do all of these people who don't have property, who don't have any access to resources, how do they survive? Well, what these people do is they go to the city and they line up outside the door of the capitalist and they compete against each other for the prize of becoming a wage worker, right? They hope to rent themselves to the capitalist, to subordinate their bodies to the command of the capitalist, to sell him their labor power. And they do this willingly, as it were, because the alternative is to starve because they don't have any access to any resources. So they become wage workers. And it is the wage workers who get to do the labor in our equation. Okay, so the resources go to the capitalists and the labor goes to the wage workers. They mine for minerals, they operate the machinery, and so on. And finally, the wealth thus produced goes mostly to the capitalist, while the workers' share will be relatively low and often minimal. Make no mistake about it, at any given moment, a substantial part of the labor sustaining capitalist growth earns a subsistence wage, a survival wage, just enough to stay alive and to produce children that will further serve the capitalist. This is necessarily so for reasons that we will explore in a future video. Cheap labor is essential for capitalist accumulation, which is to say, capitalism is dependent upon a steady supply of desperate people willing to rent themselves out for a low wage. Capitalism feeds on despair and it engineers this despair. You can see this in history. Okay, so this is capitalism's answer to the question of how to divide the resources, the labor, and the fruits of the labor among members of society. And this is measurable. This is not just a conjecture. You can go and see if this is a valid description of our society or not. You can go and see who owns the resources, who commands the labor, and who gets the wealth in our society. And notice how undemocratic this is. Democracy, demokratia in ancient Greek, means power to the people. Demos means people, the common people, and kratia means power. So demokratia literally means power to the people. Aristotle said that democracy means, in effect, rule by the poor. It's a very radical thing that happened in ancient Athens. Well, compare this to our society today. Is capitalism a society where the poor hold power? Of course not. Capitalism is premised on the disempowerment of the people. It's premised on the disappropriation of the great mass of humanity, so as to force it to willingly submit its labor power to the discretion of the owners of property. There's nothing democratic about this. Nor is there any liberty in having to submit to the will of another for most of your waking hours. To be so dependent that you are willing to do the most depressing, humiliating, dehumanizing kind of work or service under command, day in and day out, which is patently the situation for so many people in our society. So capitalism is undemocratic and it is unfree. It's premised on power and discipline, no less than earlier class societies in history. So if that's really the case, why do they say that we live in a liberal democracy? Where does so-called liberal democracy come in? Well, capitalism, this material base, tends to produce a certain kind of superficial architecture of political culture that serves its own interests. And you can actually see this unfolding in the historical record. You can see how the new rising capitalist class, the rising bourgeoisie, had to struggle against the old feudal system. And as a part of this struggle for hegemonic rule, capitalism fought to create its own religion, right? This is the Reformation, and to create its own philosophy. This is the philosophy of the Enlightenment, and its own political culture. You can see how before John Locke, before Montesquieu, before the founding fathers of the United States, the rising bourgeoisie in England set up an assembly to represent its interests against the king and against the old aristocracy. This assembly was called Parliament. And there was even a war between king and parliament during the 17th century, where eventually the crown or the executive was subordinated to the interests of the new ruling class. And a bourgeois state came into being in England. The bourgeoisie took power, right? And It found that an assembly of propertied gentlemen is a useful instrument for securing its interests. However, it was not clear that Parliament would forever remain a bourgeois assembly, and the bourgeoisie rightly feared the possibility that Parliament would fall to the control of lower classes, to the poor masses, to the petty bourgeoisie, and later also to the industrial proletariat, who were more numerous than the bourgeoisie and demanding the franchise, demanding representation, demanding the right to vote. So it was necessary to find a way to prevent the working classes from achieving effective control over the state, which they would surely use to emancipate themselves from the big bourgeoisie by re examining this question, by redistributing, in one way or another, the resources, the labor, and the fruits of the labor. And this was the tyranny of the majority that the founding fathers of the United States were concerned about. You see, they were not concerned about the individual rights of red-headed people. Yeah, they sought to protect the minority of the rich and to preserve the supremacy of the rich against the will of the people who naturally resent this domination. James Madison was very clear about his intention to protect the rich from the threat of democratia. And so, while making democratic concessions in order to appease the masses, while extending the franchise, all kinds of stratagems were designed in order to limit the effective power of the legislative assembly, to contain democracy, to prevent the people from taking effective power. For example, it was decided that the legislative assembly will not be allowed to legislate on all matters. It will not be allowed to even deliberate about the bourgeoisie privately owning virtually all of the resources necessary for the collective survival of society. It was decided that the capitalist order will never be voted on. It will be kept out of the reach of the political process. And this is what liberalism means. It's the liberty of the big bourgeoisie to remain the masters of mankind, as Adam Smith called them. It's about the liberty of the bourgeoisie to continue to command the labor of others, which is to say, to deny others of their liberty. So, no, we do not live in a liberal democracy. We live in a capitalist society that only superficially and opportunistically sets up a political culture that it misleadingly calls liberal democracy. And in fact, under certain circumstances, when capitalism is especially threatened by the agitated poor masses, when it faces the specter of true democratia, capitalist society has proven itself capable of abolishing liberal democracy and constituting an explicit political tyranny in order to liquidate the labor movement and beat the workers back into submission. So, although a strong bourgeoisie does tend to prefer a so called liberal state, under certain circumstances it might opt for a dictatorship. And so, a materialist analysis reveals that liberal democracy and fascism are not two different societies, but are merely two possible forms of bourgeois society, which is indeed the only way to explain why Churchill was so high on fascist Italy. Recall that Churchill said that liberal democracy is the best form of government in all of history, but he also believed that fascism was a close second. During the 1920s, Churchill found inspiration in Italy's ability to avert anti-capitalist revolution by turning to fascism. Churchill found comfort in the fact that if all else fails, there is an antidote to the Bolshevik virus, as he called it. And this is not only Churchill, it's many members of the ruling classes in the Western capitalist societies during the interwar years. This is well documented that they admired fascism. One cannot understand this recorded admiration of fascism among the ruling classes of the so called liberal democracies unless one understands that liberal democracy is merely one possible form of capitalist society. And notice how this materialist analysis of our modern society goes against mainstream consciousness. The bourgeoisie, the politicians, the intellectuals, and the media, they would rather have us believe that our society is a virtuous society, a society founded on good ideas and good values. They will rarely say that we are a capitalist society. They would more often say that we are a liberal democracy or the free world or the Judeo Christian civilization and so on. Time and time again, you will see that ruling classes, privileged classes, the rich, tend to portray things idealistically in order to distract us from what's really going on, in order to prevent us from seeing and questioning the one thing that is most important to our actual lives, which is the question of the distribution of resources, labor, and wealth among human beings. So, idealism is the philosophy of the powerful, trying to conceal their rule, while materialism is the method of the oppressed, trying to expose the domination that is at the base of our class society so as to better struggle against it. Materialism is a method for radical thinking. You see, radix in Latin means root, and radical means pertaining to the root. And so radical thinking is about trying to get to the root of things and to change things from the bottom, from the foundation. And that's what makes the radical left radical. That's all for now. I'd like to do more videos and analyze different case studies with the historical materialist method. I'd like to look at poverty and Zionism and 9/11 and many other subjects. If you are interested and if you'd like to be notified when a new video comes out, simply subscribe to the channel and that will do it. Goodbye for now. Take care and be good.